Hi everyone, my name is Matt and welcome to my channel. I've been slowly chipping away at some of my old world armies, and I picked up this pack of Night Goblin heroes the other day for my Orc and Goblin tribes army. Let's paint them up using contrast paint and a few tricks. After assembling the models, I undercoated them with a light gray primer, followed by a spray of white from the top and sides. If you don't have an airbrush, you could use spray cans or even dry brush the white layer if you like. First I'll start off with the skin, beginning with a layer of orc skin from Vallejo Xpress color. I like to work on one section at a time and apply plenty of paint to make sure it reaches all the recesses. Then I'll go back with the brush and soak up any excess paint. On my troops I only paint one layer of orc skin, but since I want to put a little more effort into these characters, I applied a second layer to deepen the color. If you want a simpler guide for painting Night Goblin troops, check out this video here. Next I shaded all the skin with Bealtan green. I like to apply it just like a contrast paint. I'll work on one section at a time, making sure the paint gets into the recesses, and then soak up any excess paint with the brush. We'll leave the skin for now and move on to the robes. And I'm starting those with a layer of Gryph-Charger gray. Darker contrast paints, like black Templar, can have an uneven finish over a light base coat such as white, and painting a mid-tone first will help make the end result smoother. This gray has a blue tint to it, and that will show through later as well. Next I painted a layer of black Templar on the robes. The blue-gray underlayer shows through a bit and adds a cool tone to the black. Black Templar is not a very strong color, and the end result will be more like a very dark gray rather than black. I think it's important to focus on making this layer even, rather than putting on too much paint and risking flooding the model. We'll add some darker shadows next. After that layer dried, I painted some black Templar directly into the folds and anywhere I wanted a darker shadow. I don't think any blending techniques are necessary here unless you really want to. Since it's so dark already, I don't think it will make much of a difference. Let's leave the robes for now and move on to base coating some of the other details on the models. I'd like to paint this goblin's cloak a bright red, and Blood Angel's red will make a good base coat. Contrast paint has a tendency to pool at the bottom of cloaks, so keep an eye out for it and soak up any excess paint with a brush before it starts drying. Now is a great time for me to ask you to do those YouTube things that we all love so much. If you're liking the video so far, please give it a like. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any future content. If you really like what I'm doing here and want to support the channel further, consider being a channel member. We have some perks including a Discord server and early access to videos. The red is looking a little flat, so I shaded it with Flesh Terror's red. You could paint it all over if you like, but I'm painting it directly into the folds where I want the shadows. I decided to blend some of the edges, and it's really easy to do. Just rinse the brush, wipe it on a paper towel, and then use the clean brush to soften the edge. I want this shield to be a really bright yellow, so first I need to brighten it with some white paint. You may want to paint a couple layers of white, depending on how bright you'd like the yellow to be. With the white undercoat looking nice and bright, I painted the moon with some rather fitting Bad Moon yellow contrast paint. Next I need to shade the yellow, and I diluted some Iyanden yellow with about 2 parts contrast medium to 1 part paint. It's very similar in color to Cassandora yellow shade paint, only stronger in pigment. I painted the mouths with Sigvald Burgundy. I like to paint the whole mouth, including the teeth, and I'll pick out the teeth later with an opaque paint. I find it's faster to paint it this way rather than trying to paint around the teeth. Then I painted the wood areas with Wyldwood. At this stage I'm finished using contrast paints for base coats, and I'll switch over to opaque paints for the rest. I painted all the steel areas with Iron Hand steel. I want a very smooth finish, so I like to paint a second layer after the first one dries. Then I shaded the steel with an equal parts mix of Agrax Earthshade and Nuln Oil, a mix I find really useful, and I'd recommend mixing an entire bottle of it. Check out this video here to see how to mix your own custom color. When shading swords, I like to paint a gradation on each of the sides. It's not the most realistic, but I think it has a lot of visual impact. I'll try to put a dark shadow next to a really bright section wherever I can. It bumps up the contrast on the model and makes the metals look more striking. Next I base coated any remaining armor details with Runelord brass. I like to vary the armor colors to make the models more interesting, especially on models like these with a lot of armor. I feel like they would look boring if all the armor was silver. Then I shaded the brass sections with Darkoath flesh. I like using contrast paints to shade metals sometimes. They're kind of like a wash, but stronger. Then I picked out the icons and jewelry with Retributor armor. And then I shaded those areas with Seraphim sepia. Just a few base coats left to do now, and before I paint those areas, I want to paint a narrow black line around any areas that need more definition. Next I base coated the teeth, horns, and fur pelts with Zandri dust. Then I shaded the fur with an equal parts mix of Agrax Earthshade and Nuln Oil. I picked out the teeth with Offwhite, and I also base coated all the skulls and other details with it, except for the leather straps and shoes. I painted all the skulls and mushrooms with Skeleton Horde. Sometimes I'll wipe away some of the paint with my finger, effectively making an easy highlight. I painted the baby squig, mushroom caps, and the dwarf's beard with Martian orange. After the first layer dried, I applied a second to deepen the color. Then I painted the entire dwarf's head with Darkoath flesh. I painted the hair on this skull with Basilicanum gray. And I painted the strings on all the skulls with Wyldwood. Then I base coated all the leather straps and shoes with Mournfang brown. And finally I shaded the leather with an equal parts mix of Agrax Earthshade and Nuln Oil. At this stage you could base the models and call them finished, but I'd like to put more effort into them, so we'll move on to some highlights. Let's start off by highlighting the skin with Moot green. I thinned it slightly with water, and with barely any paint on the brush, I painted a thin glaze over the skin to even out the color. You may need more or less glazing depending on how smoothly you painted the paste coats. These models don't need much. I'm mainly looking for any areas where the Bealtan green shade got too dark, and any mistakes or spills on the skin. For the highlight I'm mixing in some toxic yellow. Add as much or as little as you like, depending on how bright you want the skin to be. I think an equal parts mix is good for me. Then I picked out some of the edges and corners. You can paint the highlights on as a glaze if you prefer a more blended look, or go with just edge highlights. Faces tend to get the most attention, so that's where I'm keeping most of my focus. Next I painted the eyes, beginning with some thinned black paint. Then I painted the eye with Wild Rider red, leaving a thin black line around it. And finally I painted a dot of Fire Dragon orange in the center. I highlighted the edges of the robes with Russ gray. Because of the Gryph-Charger gray base coat underneath the black Templar, it gave the robes a bluish tone, and the color is pretty close to Russ gray on the edges where the paint is thinner. You could apply some glazes if you want, but I think I'll just stick to the edge highlights. I want to highlight the robes one more time, so I painted a few really small and narrow lines with gray Seer. I think it's easy to overdo these, so when in doubt, paint less. You can always add more later if you want to. I want to add a few freehand marks around this guy's hood. I painted a few triangles with gray Seer, and after those dried, I applied a second coat for an even finish. Then I painted a thin line of white around each. I'm not going to bother with blending or glazing, just an edge highlight. Usually I find that the smaller the detail is, the less blending it needs. The red cloak is already looking pretty good, and I don't think it needs much more. I'll paint a couple quick highlights on the very edges, starting with Wild Rider red. Then I picked out the top sections and corners with Fire Dragon. Moving on to the bright yellow next. I painted most of the edges with toxic yellow. For a really vibrant yellow, I think it's important to keep these lines as narrow as possible. If you make the highlights too wide or paint too many of them, the yellow can end up looking pale rather than vibrant. Then I mixed in some toxic yellow with Fire Dragon, and I highlighted the mushroom caps, the squig, and the dwarf beards. I decided to highlight some of the fur with gray Seer. My first inclination was to use Bonewhite, but I want the fur to stand out more from the skulls, and I thought gray might be a better choice. I painted some pink on the tongue and gums, and then I mixed in some white for another highlight. Then I highlighted the raised edges of the wood with Baneblade brown. Next I highlighted the skulls with Offwhite. I painted a glaze style highlight on some of the smoother surfaces, and then used less diluted paint to pick out the edges and the fine details. I painted the edges of the horns and the squig's teeth with Bonewhite. And then I picked out the edges with Offwhite. Then I highlighted the edges of the leather with XV88. Next I highlighted the edges of all the steel areas with Stormhost silver. I like to add a few scratches here and there too, concentrating more of the scratches on the lighter sections of the blade, and fewer scratches on the darker sections. Then I highlighted the brass areas in the same way with Canoptek alloy. And finally I highlighted the gold with a mix of about 5 parts Stormhost silver and 1 part Retributor armor. I used an old brush to apply a generous layer of wood glue on the bases, and then sprinkled on coarse gravel and fine sand. After the glue dried, I painted the bases with a layer of thinned Rhinox hide, followed by a dry brush of Steel Legion drab. I painted the rocks with Dawnstone, and then washed them with a mix of Agrax Earthshade and Nuln Oil. I painted the edge of the base with Rhinox hide, and after that dried, I applied patches of static grass with superglue. I'd like to give a big shout out to our channel members. Thank you so much for your support. It really is a huge help. If you want to be like these amazing people and help support what I'm doing here, just click the join button down below. Thank you. I really enjoy painting goblins, and I'm glad they brought back these classic models. They have tons of character, and all the little details are a great excuse to paint bright colors and add some variety to your army. Would you like to see more orcs and goblins on the channel? Or maybe something different? Drop a comment down below and share your thoughts. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and until next time, happy painting.